forgotten valley farm held more than broken fences and weathered wood. It carried a secret powerful enough to shatter reputations and expose betrayal at the highest levels. A widow and her son only wanted peace, yet they became the last line standing against a network that thrived on silence. What they uncovered would shake more than just their small town. If this journey pulls you in, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments both your thoughts and where you're watching from. Under the October moon in rural Missouri, Angela Coleman, a widowed black mother and former Army sniper, sat alone at her farmhouse kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the worn wood as if she could read in its grain the burdens of her life. The night outside was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet she had learned to distrust. Too deep, too clean, the kind that hid menace instead of promising peace. She rose slowly, every movement trained, controlled, silent, her instincts sharpened from years in combat and from months of raising her son in a town that made it clear every day that she and her boy were outsiders. Angela had moved to Willow Creek Valley hoping for a fresh start after the suspicious death of her husband, Sergeant Leon Coleman, a Delta Force operator whose training accident never sat right with her. But she quickly discovered that in this rural white town, her being black, widowed, and a soldier's wife made her and her 9-year-old son Caleb targets of whispers, scorn, and now something worse. Tonight, the quiet broke when 4 trucks rolled down the dirt road leading to her property. Their headlights were dimmed, their engines muted, but Angela could hear them, could feel the vibration against the earth. She slipped to the upstairs window with her rifle, her heart steady, her breath measured. She looked through the cracked glass and saw men climbing out, armed and coordinated. And then her stomach clenched. She recognized one of them, Jack Randall, a man who had once served under her husband. She remembered his face from the funeral, his handshake limp, his eyes cold, and she remembered thinking even then that something was wrong. Now here he was, rifle in hand, stepping out of Whitaker's truck. That meant Leon's death was no accident. It meant betrayal had been in their circle all along. Angela's pulse did not quicken from fear, but from certainty. She had been right. She always knew Leon hadn't just died in training. This was the proof walking on her land. Her hand gripped the rifle tighter, and then she heard another sound. Soft but distinct from above. A whir, mechanical, too steady for an insect. She tilted her head toward the dark Missouri sky and saw a drone circling, its red light blinking. This was not some reckless raid. This was organized, scouted, rehearsed. Someone, somewhere, was watching in real time, broadcasting her home as if it were a target range. Angela thought of Caleb asleep in his bed, his small body curled under a quilt his grandmother had sewn. 9 years old and already forced to live in a world that treated his skin as a weapon against him. 9 years old and carrying whispers about his father being a traitor. She would not let tonight add another scar to him. She moved quickly through the hallway, pressed against the hidden knot in the floorboard that lifted to reveal the underground room Leon had built before his last deployment. Caleb had thought it was just a storm shelter, but Angela knew Leon had been preparing for nights like this. She crouched beside his bed, shook him gently, whispered, "Baby, it's time to wake up." His eyes blinked open, groggy, confused. "Mama, is it morning?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "No," she said softly, forcing calm into her tone. "It's just a little adventure. We have to hide now." Caleb trusted her without question, clinging to her hand as she led him down the ladder into the reinforced room. She kissed his forehead, whispered that she loved him, then sealed the hatch and pressed it shut. Upstairs again, she returned to the window, positioned herself in the shadows, and watched the men fan out across her property. She counted their steps, measured their spacing, read their formation. They weren't thugs. They were trained, and they were here to erase her and her son. She thought of Henry Whitaker, the white land baron who had sneered at her in town, telling her she didn't belong, that her farm would be his sooner or later. He had underestimated her then, and he was underestimating her now. She steadied her breathing, lifted the rifle to her shoulder, and sighted Jack Randall in the scope. Her mind churned with memory. Leon laughing with Caleb in the yard, Leon whispering to her before his last mission, Leon's casket draped with a flag that felt more like a curtain hiding lies. Anger surged, but she forced it into focus. This was no longer about whispers in the town or racist taunts at the grocery store. This was war, and it was on her doorstep. The men adjusted their gear, whispering to each other in hand signals. The drone buzzed lower, its red eye glaring like it already owned the land. Angela's wedding band caught the moonlight as her finger brushed the trigger. She breathed out slowly. They thought she was defenseless. They thought a black widow with a young son in a lonely farmhouse could be cornered and erased. They were wrong. They didn't know that Leon had taught her everything he knew. They didn't know that she had already survived battlefields more brutal than their greed could imagine. They didn't know that every step they took closer was one step closer to their own reckoning. Angela whispered under her breath, "You won't touch him. Not tonight. Not ever." Angela had not believed it for a second. Too many details felt wrong. Too many officers avoided her eyes when they offered hollow condolences. And too many whispers in the ranks suggested Leon had been close to uncovering something he was not supposed to. At the funeral, Angela had worn her uniform, standing tall against the sea of stairs, the only black woman in the crowd of white officers and spouses. Caleb had clutched her hand so tightly that his small fingers left marks, and she had forced herself not to cry in front of him. She remembered Jack Randall there, standing stiff and cold, offering a handshake that carried no warmth. She had known even then that Leon's death was not an accident, and the sight of Jack outside her farmhouse tonight confirmed every suspicion she had buried deep inside. After the burial, after the endless paperwork, after the walls of their military housing began to feel like a cage, Angela made a decision. She would not let Caleb grow up surrounded by people who looked at him like he was an intruder in his own country. She searched county records and found a dilapidated farmhouse for sale in Willow Creek Valley, a stretch of land no one seemed to want. The house sagged on its foundations, its roof patched with tin, its barn leaning against the wind, but to her it was a fortress of possibilities. She bought it with what little savings Leon's insurance had left, packed up what she could carry, and told Caleb they were starting over. He had smiled, eager for an adventure, not realizing how heavy the burden of survival would become. When they first arrived, the townspeople had watched from porches and storefronts, their eyes narrow, their whispers unkind. Angela could feel their judgment, the way they saw her, black skin as a stain against the whitewashed farms that surrounded them. Yet not everyone turned away. George Mathers, her nearest neighbor, a frail man in his late 80s, had walked across the field with a basket of vegetables and a loaf of bread. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct, and in that moment Angela had seen something rare: respect. Over the months, George had become an unlikely ally, telling her stories of his days as a paratrooper in World War II, of nights when he had jumped into darkness not knowing if the ground below held safety or death. One evening as the sun set over the valley, she noticed a medal pinned discreetly to his coat, the same rare commendation Leon had once shown her with pride. She asked about it, and George only smiled faintly, changing the subject, but the recognition in his eyes told her he carries secrets of his own. Life in Willow Creek Valley was not easy. Every trip to town meant facing the scorn of white farmers who muttered about outsiders, and the sheriff's wary glances that never quite softened. Caleb, sweet and innocent, endured the snickers of other children who whispered about his father, repeating lies they had heard at their dinner tables. Angela taught him to stand tall, to never lower his eyes, but each night she saw the weight pressing down on his small shoulders. Still, she tried to give him pieces of normalcy, planting a small garden, repairing the old barn, teaching him to ride his bike along the gravel road. Yet even in the simplest moments, the past crept in. She often caught herself scanning the horizon, listening for sounds that didn't belong, watching for signs that the ghosts of Leon's death were still following them. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, she noticed boot prints in the mud near the barn. They were deep, military style, not her own, not Caleb's, not George's. She traced them to the edge of the woods where they vanished, as if the man had melted into the trees. She said nothing to Caleb, but that night she moved her rifle closer to the door. The ambush that came under the October moon had not surprised her. It was only the culmination of a dread that had been building for months. As she sat in the farmhouse now, her son hidden safely below, she let the memories of those 6 months wash over her like a river of grief and resolve. This farm had been meant as a refuge, a place to plant roots, a place to rebuild. Instead, it had become the stage for a battle she could no longer avoid. And yet, she would not abandon it. She would not run again. This was her ground, Leon's ground, Caleb's ground. If the Whitakers and their men wanted to come for her here, she would meet them with every ounce of strength she had left. She whispered to herself the words Leon had spoken before his last deployment, words that anchor her now as they did then. Don't bow, don't break. Stand for what's right, even if it costs everything. Her grief had forged her, and her new beginning, though soaked in hardship, had armed her for the storm. The grocery store, the post office, the schoolhouse, all of them carried the same air of suspicion, the same unspoken words etched into every glance. She was a black woman raising a black son in a town that clung to its whiteness like armor, and no matter what she did to prove she belonged, the valley seemed intent on pushing her to the margins. On a chilly Saturday morning, she took Caleb with her into town to pick up supplies. The grocery store smelled of dust and canned goods, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the aisles felt narrow not because of their size, but because of the way the people inside seemed to shrink away from her presence. Caleb clung to her hand, his wide eyes flicking from face to face, already aware that every stare was a judgment. Angela kept her head high, reminding herself that she had faced worse than stares, but the sting of it all still cut deep. Behind the counter stood a teenager who refused to look her in the eye, ringing up items with mechanical movements. Two older women whispered by the produce section, their voices low but not low enough. Angela heard the words, "doesn't belong," and taking up space. And though she had trained herself not to flinch, she felt Caleb stiffen beside her. She leaned down and whispered, "Ignore them, baby. We stand tall." Caleb nodded, but she saw the way his small hand tightened around hers. As they made their way to the door, it swung open and the mood in the store shifted. Sheriff Robert Hayes walked in, his uniform pressed, his hat tilted just so, his stride deliberate. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face carved in stone. He nodded at a few locals, then turned his gaze on Angela. His eyes held something complicated, neither open hostility nor kindness, but a guarded calculation. "Morning, Mrs. Coleman," he said evenly. His voice was calm, but the weight in his tone suggested something unspoken. Angela met his gaze squarely, refusing to show even a flicker of unease. "Sheriff." Caleb stayed close, watching the exchange like he could sense the tension between them. Hayes' eyes flicked to Caleb for a moment, then back to Angela. "Everything all right out at the farm?" he asked, his words casual, but she knew better than to believe in casual questions. "We're managing," she replied, her tone measured. He nodded slowly, then adjusted his hat. "Good. Just keep your eyes open. Folks out here don't always take kindly to change." His words lingered as he walked past her, leaving Angela with the uneasy feeling that his warning carried more weight than just small-town prejudice. As she stepped outside with Caleb, she saw a sleek black truck parked across the street. Leaning against it was none other than Henry Whitaker, the man who had become a thorn in her side since the day she set foot in Willow Creek Valley. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a smile that never reached his eyes, Henry was the kind of man who treated the world like it was his to own. And, in many ways, it was. His family had money, land, and influence that stretched across the county, and he wielded them like weapons. "Mrs. Coleman," he called out smoothly, his voice dripping with false charm. "What a surprise to see you here. I thought you'd be too busy tending to that rundown patch of dirt you call a farm." Angela stopped, her jaw tightening, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "It's my farm, Mr. Whitaker, and it's enough for me and my son." Caleb pressed closer against her leg, his eyes fixed on the man who spoke with such contempt. Henry's smile widened, but it carried the edge of a blade. "Your farm, you say? Interesting. You know, that land has a history. Belonged to families who knew how to take care of it, who kept it thriving. I can't imagine it lasting long under your circumstances." His eyes flicked down to Caleb, and Angela felt the threat in his gaze like a strike. "Leave him out of this," she snapped, her voice low but firm. Henry chuckled, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation. But if you ever decide you're in over your head, remember I'd be happy to take that land off your hands. For a fair price, of course." The word fair twisted in his mouth, mocking her. Angela didn't respond. She tightened her grip on Caleb's hand and walked past him, her back rigid, her fury burning in her chest. She could feel his eyes following them until they turned the corner. Later that day, Angela stopped by the sheriff's office to pay a bill for her property taxes. The walls of the office were lined with old photographs, faces of past sheriffs, war heroes, and county leaders. She scanned them absently until one particular photo froze her in place. Sheriff Hayes stood in the center, younger, in uniform, his arm around none other than General Douglas Kane. The same general whose name had come up in whispers about Leon's death. The same general she suspected was tied to the corruption that had taken her husband's life. Her stomach knotted, but she forced her expression to remain neutral as Hayes returned to the front desk. He noticed her gaze and gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Old photo," he said. "Long time ago." Angela nodded, but said nothing. The tension between them thickened, an unspoken acknowledgement that both knew more than they were saying. That night, as she put Caleb to bed, she tucked the quilt around him and tried to hide the storm in her heart. He looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Mama, why do they hate us?" he asked softly. The question stabbed at her, sharper than any bullet she had ever faced. She stroked his hair, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Because they don't understand us, baby. And people fear what they don't understand. But you remember this, you are strong, you are worthy, and no one can take that from you." Angela Coleman awoke before dawn the next morning, her eyes burning from a restless night spent at the window watching shadows slip across her fields. The conversation with Henry Whitaker still echoed in her ears, his words dripping with arrogance, his veiled threats aimed at Caleb as much as at her farm. The photograph she had seen in Sheriff Hayes' office haunted her even more, because if Hayes had once stood side by side with General Douglas Kane, then every suspicion she had about Leon's death being more than an accident had new weight. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Caleb, and poured herself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in the pot. She sat at the table and stared at the chipped wood, her thoughts circling back to Leon's last words before his deployment, words she had almost dismissed as paranoia but which now felt like prophecy. "If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone in uniform unless you know where their loyalty lies." Angela had thought then he meant foreign soldiers or mercenaries, but now she knew better. The enemy was closer, embedded in the very soil of their country, wearing badges and medals as if those emblems could wash away their crimes. Later that morning, she drove into town with Caleb to pick up supplies again, her rifle hidden under the seat just in case. The streets felt emptier than usual, the silence heavier, and as she parked the truck near the bank, she noticed a man leaning against the brick wall, his posture casual but his eyes locked on her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin dark like hers, and there was a familiarity in his stance that made her freeze. He pushed off the wall as she stepped out, his voice low but steady. "Angela Coleman?" She nodded cautiously, her hand brushing Caleb's shoulder to keep him behind her. The man extended his hand. "Name's Derek Johnson. I served with Leon overseas." Angela's chest tightened, suspicion and hope colliding in her. She shook his hand, her eyes narrowing. "You served with my husband?" Derek nodded, his expression earnest. "We were on missions together. He saved my life once in Kandahar. He trusted me. And before he left for his last deployment, he told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should find you." Angela's breath caught. "He told you that?" Derek's gaze hardened. "Yes." He knew he was in deep. He uncovered something that had powerful men tied up in it. He didn't tell me everything, but he said it was big enough to get him killed. And he said you and Caleb might be in danger if anyone knew what he was working on. Angela felt her knees weaken, but she steadied herself against the truck, refusing to show vulnerability in front of Caleb. "What exactly did he uncover?" she asked. Derek looked around the street, then leaned in closer. "Illegal arms, smuggling. Not just overseas, but right here, through the Midwest. He found out that Kane and Whitaker were tied together in it. Weapons moving through farmland, stored in warehouses that looked like any other storage sheds. Leon had evidence. He told me if he didn't come back, I had to help you. That's why I'm here." Angela's mind spun. This was confirmation of everything she had suspected, but hearing it aloud made the danger feel heavier, more immediate. She looked at Caleb, who was clutching her coat tightly, sensing the tension even if he didn't fully understand. "Why wait until now?" she asked, her voice sharp. Derek's jaw tightened. "I didn't know where you were. Leon didn't tell me specifics, only that you'd need help if things went south. I only tracked you down when word got around that you bought this farm. And then I heard Whitaker's name attached to trouble again, so I came." Angela studied him, her instincts screaming, to doubt, to question, to guard herself. But there was something in his eyes, a steadiness that reminded her of Leon's brothers in arms, the kind of loyalty that could only be forged in battle. Still, trust was not something she could give lightly. "If you're here to help, prove it," she said. Derek nodded. "Fair enough, but I need to know if Leon left anything behind. Notes, files, a laptop, anything." Angela hesitated, remembering the hidden hatch in the barn, the reinforced chamber Leon had left for them. She hadn't yet explored it fully, not beyond the emergency supplies. Could there be more inside? More than even she realized? Maybe, she admitted carefully. "But I don't show strangers what's in my house." Derek didn't argue. He only nodded, his expression grim. "Then keep it safe, because if Leon was right, there are people watching you already." As if to punctuate his words, Angela noticed a shimmer of metal under her truck seat when she climbed back inside. She pulled it free and found a small device, no bigger than a coin, with a blinking green light. A bug. Someone had planted it there, recording every trip she made into town, every word she spoke in the cab. Rage flared in her chest as she crushed the device under her boot on the pavement. Caleb's eyes widened. "Mama, what was that?" She forced calm into her voice. "Nothing you need to worry about, baby. Just trash." But inside she knew it was proof that she and Caleb were already targets. Their lives tracked, their safety compromised. She turned to Derek. "You were right. They're watching." Derek's face hardened. "Then we don't have much time." That night, after Caleb fell asleep, Angela sat alone in the barn with a lantern and stared at the hatch in the floor. Her hand trembled as she lifted it and descended into the chamber. Angela Coleman barely slept after finding Leon's files in the hidden bunker, her mind swirling with words like Project Phoenix and the names Kane and Whitaker scrawled in Leon's handwriting. She sat in the kitchen long past midnight, staring at the evidence and replaying Derek Johnson's warnings. They were being watched, and the proof of the bug under her truck seat meant she had to assume every move was being tracked. When morning came, she forced herself into routine, cooking eggs for Caleb and packing his lunch for school, masking her exhaustion with the same discipline that had carried her through her years as a soldier. Caleb noticed though, because he was old enough to read her moods. "Mama, are we safe?" he asked quietly, his brown eyes wide with the kind of fear a child shouldn't carry. Angela crouched down and kissed his forehead. "You're safe with me, baby. Always." But she knew her words were promises she had to fight to keep. She drove him to school in silence, scanning every car on the road, every pedestrian on the sidewalks. The school sat on the edge of town, its brick walls cracked with age, its playground half rusted. And though it should have been a sanctuary for children, Angela knew it was another battlefield where prejudice thrived. The teachers pretended to be polite, but the looks, the whispers, the subtle favoritism shown to white children were constant. And then there were the bullies. That morning, as soon as Caleb stepped into the schoolyard, Jason Whitaker, Henry's nephew, appeared with two of his friends. Jason was 12, older and bigger than Caleb, with the same sneering arrogance as his uncle. "Hey, traitor's kid," Jason spat, shoving Caleb's shoulder. Caleb stumbled, but stood tall, remembering what his mother had taught him. Jason grinned cruelly. "Heard your daddy got himself killed because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Guess being stupid runs in the family." The other boys laughed, circling Caleb like wolves. Angela, who had not yet driven away, saw it unfold from the truck and her body tensed, every instinct screaming to intervene. But she also knew Caleb needed to face this in his own way. She cracked the window and listened, ready to step in if things turned violent. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Don't talk about my dad." Jason smirked, leaning close. "Why not? Everybody knows he was a traitor. My uncle says he was spying on his own country. That's why he's dead." The words pierced Caleb, cutting deeper than any shove or punch. How could Jason know details about Leon's death? Details that only men like Kane or Henry would know. Angela realized in that moment that the lies were being spread deliberately, weaponized to smear Leon's name and break Caleb's spirit. Jason shoved Caleb again, harder this time, knocking his lunch to the dirt. "You don't belong here," Jason said. "Neither of you do. This town doesn't want you." Caleb clenched his fists but didn't swing, standing tall even as tears threatened. At that moment, a girl stepped out from the crowd. Naomi Bennett, a quiet mixed-race student from Caleb's class, pushed between Jason and Caleb. "Leave him alone," she said firmly, her voice shaking but strong. Jason scoffed. "Stay out of it." But Naomi stood her ground, glaring at him with a defiance that seemed far older than her years. Jason's smirk faltered, and he finally backed off, muttering curses as he walked away with his friends. Caleb looked at Naomi with gratitude, but Angela, watching from the truck, felt both relief and fury. Relief that her son had someone willing to stand beside him, fury that Henry Whitaker's family had sunk so low as to poison children with their lies. Later that day, Angela met Naomi's aunt, Clara Bennett, a teacher at the school who pulled her aside. Clara was a white woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and a cautious voice. "I saw what happened this morning," she said quietly. "I try to protect the kids, but the Whitakers, they own too much of this town. People look the other way because they're afraid." Angela nodded, her jaw tight. "My son won't be broken by their fear." Clara hesitated, then added, "Naomi's father was black. He died years ago, and the Whitakers made sure people remembered. They won't stop with your son. Be careful." Angela thanked her, but walked away with her rage simmering hotter than before. That evening, Caleb sat at the table, poking at his dinner, his usual chatter muted. Finally, he looked up and asked, "Mama, was Daddy a traitor?" Angela froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. The pain in his voice ripped through her. She set the fork down and leaned forward, taking his hand in hers. "Baby, your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew. He loved his country, but more than that, he loved us. He died because he stood up for what was right, not because he betrayed anyone." Caleb's lip trembled, but he nodded, clinging to her words. Angela held him close, silently vowing that she would clear Leon's name no matter the cost. She knew now more than ever that the lies were deliberate, calculated, and orchestrated by Henry Whitaker and General Douglas Kane to destroy Leon's legacy and weaken the family he left behind. As Caleb slept peacefully in his room, she carried a lantern out to the barn, her steps steady on the damp earth, the cool October air chilling her skin. She paused at the barn door, listening to the quiet countryside, every sound magnified in her sharpened senses, before pulling it open and stepping inside. The barn smelled of hay, dust, and old wood, but underneath lingered a metallic scent that carried her back to Leon's presence. She approached the hatch in the floor, knelt, and pressed against the knot in the wood until it clicked and lifted, revealing the dark mouth of the underground chamber. She climbed down the ladder with the lantern in hand, the light flickering against steel walls. The shelter was small but fortified, the kind of place built by a man who knew enemies could come from anywhere. On shelves along the wall sat canned food, water, and medical supplies. But Angela's attention was fixed on the metal case she had opened before, the one holding Leon's files. She set the lantern down, opened the case again, and pulled out the laptop, the hard drives, and the thick folders labeled in Leon's meticulous handwriting. She flipped through them carefully, her eyes catching words and maps that made her breath tighten. Project Phoenix wasn't just an arms smuggling ring, it was a network that stretched across multiple states, with routes marked through farmland, hidden in warehouses, and shielded by powerful names. The maps bore red circles around several locations, and to her horror, one was Willow Creek Valley itself. Leon had known that their own community was being used as a pipeline. The folders contained lists of names, some she recognized and some she did not. Contractors, retired officers, politicians, and even local businessmen. Henry Whitaker's name appeared repeatedly, tied to warehouses disguised as agricultural storage. General Kane's name was scrawled in bold across one page, with arrows connecting him to offshore accounts and defense contracts. Leon had left no doubt this was a conspiracy of men who profited from war and hid behind patriotism while betraying their own. Angela's chest ached as she found a sealed envelope tucked into the back of the folder. Her hands shook as she tore it open and unfolded Leon's handwritten letter. The words leapt off the page. "Angela, if you are reading this, it means I didn't make it back. They will tell you it was an accident, but it wasn't. Kane and Whitaker are moving weapons through farmland. They kill anyone who gets too close. I have left you the evidence. Trust no one in uniform. Protect Caleb above all else. He is the reason I fight, and you are the reason I never gave up. Finish what I started, but do not let them break you." Tears blurred Angela's vision, but she forced herself to keep reading until the last line. "If you ever doubt yourself, remember you are always the strongest of us." She folded the letter back carefully, pressing it to her chest, her grief cutting as sharp as her resolve. She whispered into the darkness, "I'll finish it, Leon. I swear." She turned to the laptop, connected the drive, and powered it on. The screen flickered before loading a secure folder with files, photographs, and video recordings. She clicked through them, her jaw tightening at the images of crates marked with military insignia being loaded into civilian trucks, weapons hidden under produce shipments, soldiers in uniform escorting shipments under the guise of training exercises. One video in particular made her blood run cold. Leon himself appeared on screen, his face drawn but determined, his voice steady. If you're watching this, it means they silenced me. Kane and Whitaker are using Chimera Holdings as a cover for smuggling weapons out of bases and into private markets. They will kill to protect it. Do not trust anyone wearing the flag unless you know their loyalty. Angela, if this gets to you, hide Caleb, protect him. Expose them if you can, but never let them touch our son. Angela shut the laptop, her chest heaving. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, but with it came clarity. She knew now why Jason Whitaker had spoken with such certainty about Leon's death. The lies were being fed to him by his uncle, and Kane's influence spread through every corner of their world. The enemy wasn't just at her doorstep, it was entrenched in her community, teaching children to hate, twisting stories to destroy. She climbed back up the ladder, sealing the hatch with steady hands. Caleb was awake when she returned, rubbing his eyes sleepily as he padded into the kitchen. "Mama, were you in the barn again?" he asked. Angela knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms. "Yes, baby, I was. Your daddy left us something important, proof that he was a hero, not what they say." Caleb's eyes lit with cautious hope. "So he wasn't a traitor?" Angela shook her head firmly. "No, sweetheart. He was the bravest man I ever knew, and he fought to protect us. They're lying because they're scared of the truth." Caleb nodded, his small shoulders squaring with a strength that both broke and healed her heart. "Then we have to tell everyone," he said. Angela smiled sadly, brushing his cheek. "One day we will, but for now, we have to be smart. We have to be strong." That evening, Angela locked the files in a trunk beneath her bed, but she knew hiding them would not be enough. Project, Phoenix, Chimera Holdings, Kane, Whitaker, all of it was tied together in a knot of betrayal, and she had been left to untangle it while keeping Caleb safe. The thought of her son's small voice asking if his father was a traitor filled her with a renewed rage that sharpened into focus. She would clear Leon's name, but she had to move carefully because she could already feel the net closing in around them. Sheriff Robert Hayes arrived that afternoon in his patrol car, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway. Angela stiffened, her rifle within reach behind the door, but she stepped outside to meet him. Hayes removed his hat and looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than ever. A mix of weariness, regret, and warning. "You've stirred up something, Mrs. Coleman," he said quietly. "The Whitakers are nervous, and when they're nervous, people get hurt." Angela crossed her arms, her tone flat. "And you're here to protect me? Or to make sure I stay in line?" Hayes' jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I'm here because I know more than you think. I knew your husband. He was a good soldier, and I know Kane. I served under him once, long before all this, and I saw the way he moved pieces on the board. If you found what Leon was working on, then you already know Kane and Whitaker aren't just businessmen. They're killers with power." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Then why wear that badge if you know the truth?" Hayes looked out over the fields, his voice low. "Because sometimes the only way to take down a beast is from the inside. I've been watching, gathering what I can, waiting for a chance. You're not the only one trying to bring them down." Angela studied him, torn between distrust and the possibility that he might be telling the truth. She remembered Leon's warning not to trust anyone in uniform, but she also saw in Hayes' eyes a flicker of the same weariness she carried, the weight of someone who had seen too much and carried it alone. Before she could respond, Caleb burst out of the house, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He froze at the sight of Hayes, his young eyes wary. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go wait inside the truck, baby." Caleb obeyed, and Hayes lowered his voice. "They're circling you, Angela. You need to be careful where you step. The Whitakers control half this county, and Kane controls the rest. They won't stop with rumors about Leon. They'll come after Caleb if they think it will break you." Angela's blood went cold. "They've already tried," she said, thinking of Jason Whitaker's cruel words at school. Hayes nodded grimly. "Then it's starting." He tipped his hat, gave her a final look that carried both warning and reluctant respect, and left. Angela stood in the driveway, watching his taillights vanish, knowing his visit meant the walls were closing in faster than she had feared. Later that day, as she drove Caleb to school, a black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. Its windows were tinted, its presence silent but heavy. It followed them all the way into town, idling when she stopped at the school, parked across the street as Caleb walked through the gates. Angela's instincts screamed that it wasn't just anyone watching it, was Kane's men, eyes trained on Caleb. She sat in the truck longer than usual, her grip tight on the steering wheel, her pulse hammering. When she finally drove away, the SUV pulled out behind her, following for miles before vanishing down a side road. That evening, Caleb returned home quiet, his usual energy dimmed. When Angela pressed him, he admitted that the same SUV had been outside the school playground, parked by the fence. "It felt like they were watching me," he whispered. Angela hugged him tightly, hiding the fire in her chest. They weren't just circling anymore, they were closing in on the one thing she couldn't lose. That night, Angela sat at the kitchen table with Derek Johnson, who had returned after hearing whispers of activity in town. She slid Leon's files across the table, showing him the maps, the accounts, the video. Derek's face hardened as he studied the evidence. "This is bigger than I thought. Kane's been running this operation for years, but with Whitaker's land and influence, they've got a pipeline no one questions. If these files go public, it could burn them down. But it also paints a target on you and Caleb." Angela's eyes burned with resolve. "The target's already there. They killed Leon for this. They've poisoned Caleb's name. I won't let them bury the truth too." Derek leaned forward. "Then we need allies. Hayes might be one, but we can't trust him fully. The Bennetts might help too, but once we move, they'll push back hard. And if Kane knows you've got the files, he'll send more than Whitaker's men. He'll send soldiers." Angela nodded, the lantern light flickering across her face. "Then let them come. I'm ready." The farmhouse seemed to shudder around her as the wind howled against its old frame, but Angela stood rooted, her will unbreakable. Angela Coleman drove into Willow Creek the following evening under the cover of dusk, her mind focused on the evidence she carried in Leon's files and the weight of the conversation with Derek Johnson still pressing against her chest. The black SUV that had stalked her and Caleb the day before was nowhere in sight, but she knew better than to assume it was gone. If Kane's men were watching, they would only retreat to strike harder later. Tonight she was taking a risk, meeting Derek at the shuttered bank on Main Street to exchange copies of the files and discuss the next step. The bank had closed months earlier after Whitaker pulled his investments, leaving it an empty shell of brick and glass, perfect for a quiet meeting where no one would look for them. Angela parked her truck in the alley, checked her rifle, and slipped inside through the side entrance. The building smelled of dust and mildew, the echoes of footsteps amplifying in the hollow space. Derek was already there, his broad shoulders hunched over a table where he had spread out maps and notebooks. He looked up and nodded. "You came." Angela's voice was steady, her fear tucked away behind discipline. "I wasn't going to hide while they circle my son. We need to move." Derek gestured to the files. "With what you've got, we can expose them. But we need a secure channel. Someone outside this county who isn't in Kane's pocket. A journalist maybe, or federal investigators not tied to his command." Angela frowned. "And you trust any of them?" "Leon told me to trust no one in uniform, and the media can be bought just as easily." Derek exhaled. "Then we need to survive long enough to find the right person. That's the first step." He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "I need you to know something. A few weeks ago, Whitaker's men came to me. They wanted me on their side. Offered money, a job, protection. I told them no, and I knew what it meant. I knew they'd come after me next. But I chose to stand with Leon's family. You need to know that so you don't doubt me." Angela studied his face, searching for cracks, but found only grim resolve. "Then we stand together," she said. She slid one of the hard drives across the table. "Keep this. If they come for me, the truth can't die here." Before Derek could respond, the front windows shattered inward, and armed men in tactical gear poured into the bank. Their movements were sharp, practiced, not like common thugs, but soldiers trained for coordinated assault. Angela dropped to cover, firing a shot that sent one attacker sprawling. Derek grabbed the hard drive and pulled his pistol, covering her as bullets ripped into the walls around them. The attackers shouted commands, moving with hand signals Angela recognized from her time in the service. Her stomach twisted. These weren't just mercenaries. These were ex-special forces, men who had once worn the same uniform as Leon. She fired again, taking down another, but the odds pressed against them. Derek shouted over the gunfire, "They know about the files!" Angela's heart clenched. Then Kane must have a mole close by. Someone fed him our location. She thought of Sheriff Hayes, his cryptic warnings, his photo with Kane. Was he playing both sides, or had someone else betrayed them? The question seared her even as she fought for survival. A bullet tore through Derek's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Angela covered him, firing in rapid bursts, her hands steady despite the chaos. She dragged him behind a pillar, blood seeping through his shirt. He pressed the hard drive into her hand, his face pale but determined. Take it, don't let them win. Leon died for this. If I fall too, make it count. Angela's throat burned, but she refused to let despair take her. You're not dying here. Not like this. Derek gritted his teeth, returning fire with his good arm. You don't get it. They want you alive long enough to hand over the files, but they'll kill Caleb to break you. Don't let them near him. Ever. The thought of Caleb's face flashed through her mind, his small voice asking if his father was a traitor, his innocent trust. Fury surged in her veins, fueling her aim as she took down another attacker. The gunfire grew heavier, the walls riddled with holes, the air thick with dust and smoke. Angela realized they couldn't hold the building much longer. She grabbed Derek, hauling him toward the side exit, her muscles straining. They stumbled into the alley, the cool night air slamming against their sweat-soaked bodies. More men waited outside, but Angela was faster, dropping two before they could raise their rifles. She shoved Derek into the truck and peeled out of the alley as bullets shattered the rear window. The engine roared, tires screeching as she tore down back roads, weaving through the dark countryside until the gunfire faded behind them. Derek slumped against the seat, blood staining the upholstery, his breathing ragged. Angela pressed the hard drive into her jacket, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel. She knew Kane had escalated. This was no longer intimidation. This was annihilation. By attacking the bank, Kane had shown that he could unleash soldiers on American soil, men trained by the same system that had trained Leon, men who had chosen greed and corruption over honor. Angela's trust fractured further. She thought of Hayes again. Was his warning genuine or part of the trap? The doubt coiled in her gut, but she couldn't afford to waste time on it now. She sped toward the farmhouse, every mile heavy with the weight of betrayal. When they reached the farm, George Mathers met them at the door, his old body still strong as he helped her drag Derek inside. George's eyes widened at the blood, but hardened with resolve. Angela Coleman barely slept after dragging Derek Johnson home from the failed bank meeting, her body tense and her mind running through every scenario of how Kane and Whitaker might strike back. She knew the ambush in town wasn't meant to kill her outright, but to break her defenses, to bleed away allies until she stood alone. Now Derek lay weak on the farmhouse table, his bandaged shoulder seeping through, George Mathers pacing like a restless sentinel, and Caleb sleeping in the reinforced room below with his arms wrapped around his stuffed bear. Angela stood by the window, her rifle against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the fields under the pale wash of moonlight. For a few hours the valley seemed still, as if holding its breath, but she knew better than to trust silence. By dawn, the first signs came: dust rising on the horizon, the low rumble of engines, then the unmistakable silhouettes of multiple vehicles. She counted at least 6 trucks, heavier than the ones she had seen before, packed with armed men. This was not a warning. This was the siege. Angela's heart pounded, but her movements stayed sharp as she locked the doors, loaded magazines, and double-checked the hatch where Caleb slept. She knelt by him and whispered, "Stay down here, no matter what. Do not open this door unless I tell you." Caleb's frightened eyes searched hers. "Mama, are they coming again?" Angela cupped his face, steady and fierce. "Yes, baby, but I'll stop them, I promise." She closed the hatch, sealing him into safety, and returned upstairs where George was arming himself with an old hunting rifle. Angela gave him a sharp look. "You don't have to do this." George's jaw tightened, his weathered hands steady. "I fought Nazis in Normandy. I'm not about to sit out while these bastards come for a boy who calls me neighbor. Let them try." Angela felt something stir in her chest, respect and gratitude that words could not carry. Together they took positions, Angela at the upstairs window, George crouched by the doorway. The trucks rolled up the driveway and spread across the yard, men spilling out with military precision. Angela recognized their movements, instantly squad formations, overlapping cover, suppression tactics. These were soldiers, not criminals, trained in the same doctrine she once followed. At the center of it all stood General Douglas Kane, his tall frame rigid, his metals glinting even in the gray light. He carried himself not like a man leading a raid, but like a commander inspecting a battlefield he already owned. Angela's rage flared white hot. This was the man who had ordered Leon's death, who had turned comrades into killers, who had twisted honor into profit. She sighted him through her scope, her finger resting against the trigger, but she held back. Killing him outright would end her chance at answers. She needed to know everything before the bullet found its mark. The first shots rang out, shattering windows as bullets sprayed across the farmhouse. Angela returned fire, dropping one of the advancing men, her aim precise, her breathing steady despite the chaos. George fired from his position, his old rifle kicking hard against his shoulder, and to Angela's astonishment, he dropped an intruder who had slipped toward the porch. The old soldier grunted. "Still got it." Angela almost smiled, but more men surged forward, their rifles barking, their boots pounding against the earth. Smoke grenades arced through the windows, filling the rooms with acrid haze. Angela coughed, her eyes burning, but she adjusted her position, firing blind through the silhouette she saw in the smoke. One man burst through the back door only to meet George's bayonet in a brutal takedown that left blood splattering the floorboards. Angela shouted, "Hold the line!" and they fought back to back, the farmhouse groaning under the onslaught. Upstairs, Angela heard heavier boots and turned to see 3 men storming the hall. She shot the first, grappled with the second, and slammed his head against the wall until he dropped. The third lunged with a knife, but Angela spun, seized his arm and snapped it with a twist before firing point blank into his chest. Her body burned with exertion, her ears ringing, but she pressed forward, knowing Caleb's life depended on her every move. Downstairs, George shouted as another wave pressed the porch, but his voice carried strength. The siege dragged on for what felt like hours, the farmhouse riddled with bullet holes, the air thick with smoke and gunpowder. Angela's ammunition ran low, her muscles screamed, but she fought with the memory of Leon's voice in her ears. Stand for what's right, even if it costs everything. Then came the moment she had dreaded. A booming voice thundered through the chaos. "Angela Coleman, enough blood. Come out, and maybe your boy lives." It was Kane himself, standing in the open yard, his pistol in hand, his soldiers circling behind him. Angela froze, her breath sharp. "He's safe," she whispered to herself, reminding her heart that Caleb was hidden. But Kane's words cut deeper. He knew exactly where to aim his threats. George growled from his post. "He's bluffing. Don't give him an inch." Angela steadied herself, but before she could respond, another voice came from the stairwell. "It's true." A soldier stepped into view, dragging George by the collar, his rifle pressed against the old man's head. George spat blood but glared with defiance. Angela's heart clenched, torn between her oath to protect Caleb and the sight of the only ally she had left at gunpoint. Kane stepped closer, his face clear in the smoke. "Your husband died because he thought he could expose me. Do you want your son to die too? Hand me the files, and maybe you'll both live." Angela's fury erupted. She raised her rifle, her fingers steady. "You'll never touch him," she hissed. Kane's smile was cruel. "You're outnumbered. You're surrounded. The boy will break. They all do." The smoke still clung to the rafters of the farmhouse when the final echoes of gunfire faded into the Missouri night, leaving Angela Coleman standing in the wreckage with her rifle lowered but her spirit still burning. George Mathers leaned against the wall, bruised and bloodied but alive, his old eyes shining with stubborn pride. Derek Johnson lay on the couch, his wound bound tighter, his face pale yet conscious, nodding at Angela as if to say he had not given up either. Beneath the floor, Caleb stirred in the reinforced chamber, his small voice trembling as he called out, "Mama, is it over?" Angela pressed her hand against the wooden hatch and answered with a strength she barely felt. "Yes, baby, it's over for now." But in her heart, she knew the war wasn't finished. The siege had been a battle, a test of her will, but the true enemy still lived in the Valley of Power, shielded by wealth and uniform. And then she saw him, Henry Whitaker, crawling through the mud outside, his leg twisted from a bullet wound, his white shirt stained red, his face still twisted with arrogance despite the blood streaming down. He had survived the chaos, protected by the men Kane had sent, but now he was broken, his empire fractured, and his mask of invincibility torn away. Angela strode out onto the porch, her boots crunching over shattered glass and splintered wood, her rifle slung but ready. She stood over him, her shadow stretching long in the moonlight, her breath slow and steady. Henry spat into the dirt, glaring up at her with venom. "You think you've won?" Cain is bigger than this town, bigger than me. Cut off one head and two more will rise. You and your boy won't last." Angela stared down at him, her jaw tight, her body trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. She could end him here, silence the venom, and stop one chain in the machine with a single pull of the trigger. The temptation seared through her veins because she remembered Caleb's tears when he asked if his father was a traitor. She remembered Jason's smirk in the schoolyard, and she remembered Leon's name dragged through the mud. But she also remembered Leon's words, written in the farewell letter, reminding her that she was the strongest of them, that she must protect Caleb above all, and that standing for what was right meant not becoming like those they fought. George hobbled onto the porch, leaning heavily on his rifle, his voice rasping. "You don't need to kill him, Angela. Drag him into the light instead. Let the world see what he is." Derek coughed from inside, his voice strained but firm. "Expose him. Expose Cain. If you shoot him now, they'll make you the villain. If you let him live, you'll burn them all with truth." Angela's hand shook as she lowered her rifle, the weight of vengeance slipping from her shoulders like chains unfastened. She grabbed Henry by the collar and dragged him across the yard, his curses echoing in the cold night, until she shoved him against one of his own trucks. She bound his hands with cable ties from her kit and pressed a hard drive into his face. "You built your empire on lies," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "Now the truth will bear you." Henry laughed bitterly, even as he winced in pain. "Truth doesn't matter in this world, power does." Angela leaned close, her eyes burning. "Then watch what happens when power rots." By morning, the farmhouse yard was crowded with flashing lights, cameras, and microphones. News vans lined the road as reporters shouted questions, the siege already spreading across the airwaves. Somehow, whether by Hayes' hand or Derek's silent connections, the files Leon had left had reached beyond the valley and into national headlines. Project Phoenix, Chimera Holdings, Cain's smuggling operations, it all spilled out in front of the nation, undeniable and irrefutable. Angela stood on the porch with Caleb at her side, his small hand clutching hers, his eyes wide but proud as he watched the crowd. She held up Leon's photograph for all to see, her voice steady, though her throat ached with emotion. "My husband was no traitor. He was a soldier who uncovered corruption at the highest levels and died for it. They called him a liar. They told my son he should be ashamed of his father. But the truth is here now, and no amount of bullets or lies can bury it. This was not just about my family. It was about every soldier used as a pawn, every community poisoned by greed, and every child forced to believe that honor is weakness. I will not bow. I will not break. And I will not let his name be stolen." The crowd erupted with questions, but Angela's voice cut through them like a blade. Leon Coleman was a hero, and the men who killed him will face justice. Caleb looked up at her with tears in his eyes, not from fear this time, but from pride. "Mama," he whispered, "Daddy would be proud." Angela bent down, kissed his forehead, and whispered back, "So am I." Later, as the sun sank and the valley bathed in orange light, George sat with Derek on the porch while Angela watched Caleb play in the yard, his laughter finally free of the shadows that had chased him for months. She knew the fight wasn't over. Cain's empire was vast, and Whitaker's warning about more heads rising was no empty threat. But for now, Leon's name was cleared, Caleb's spirit was unbroken, and the world finally saw the truth. Angela stood taller, her body tired, but her resolve stronger than ever, and she whispered into the wind, "Justice is stronger than vengeance. The end." If you follow Angela and Caleb's fight until the end, I'd love to hear what you think. Which part of the story hit you hardest, the ambush under the October moon, the schoolyard cruelty, or the final stand at the farmhouse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also share where in the world you're watching this from. Your support keeps these stories alive, so if you want more tales of courage, justice, and truth, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.